Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sophos MDR ThreatCast 2025 edition. My name is Greg Idden. I am the services architect for Sophos MDR and our managed services division. Joining me today are a number of fantastic people. We've got Dan Inglis in Threat Intelligence, as well as Colin Cowie, also from Threat Intelligence. We've got Pavla Kulam from Threat Hunting, who's going to be taking us through some cool stuff. And we've also got Sean Gallagher here from Threat Research and the XOps side of things to give us kind of an overview of the kind of research we're putting out. In terms of agenda, we're going to stick to the standard format. We're going to have Dan take us through the threat landscape, what's been going on in the wider world. We're going to have Colin take us through the observed threat activity, what we've been seeing here in Sophos MDR. Then we're going to do some threat hunting highlights. So Pavla is going to take us through a few interesting highlights of hunts that we've done in the last sort of 30 days. And then Sean's going to take us through kind of the XOps content that's gone out on Sophos News and the kind of new and interesting articles and bits of research that have been put together over the last 30 days. At the end, we'll do Q&A as always. And just as a gentle reminder for everyone, if you have any questions at all on anything, either content related, threat related, Sophos related at all, there is the Q&A panel you can see on the right of your screen. Click that, drop a question in there. It probably won't pop up in the wider thing. I don't think everyone will see the questions because we're not publishing them, because I don't think this platform supports anonymized questions just yet, and when it does, we'll do that. So what we'll do, we'll either take your question and I'll interject and ask the presenter to answer it live. We'll either answer it in the sort of Q&A panel itself, give you a text response, or we'll hold on to it and we'll then bring it up right at the end of the Q&A section. I'm sure we're going to get this question again. We always get this question multiple times. Yes, we are recording. This video recording will be made available, including all the references to the content that we've shown here today will be made available on the Sophos MDR community channel within roughly the next 24 hours or so. And then I think usually in about 10 days or some period of time, it will also make its way to YouTube. All right, that's enough of my voice. Let's get Dan on stage, and Dan's going to take us through the threat landscape. So Dan Inglis, come join us.
So welcome everyone, and thank you all for attending this month's ThreatCast. So to kick off the landscape section, we're going to start with something that got quite a bit of mainstream news coverage, a wave of cyber attacks targeting major UK retailers. So Marks & Spencer's, Co-op, and a few others were hit with incidents that were linked to the Dragon Force ransomware, and more broadly to a threat group that overlaps with Scattered Spider. So what stands out about these attacks isn't necessarily who got hit, it's more so how. So these groups are bypassing traditional defense mechanisms and going straight through the help desk. So they're impersonating employees, claiming to be locked out, and then pressuring IT staff into either resetting their credentials or disabling MFA. So this isn't an isolated attack either. So in a report published earlier this year by the Sophos MDR team, we discussed how Black Bass's affiliates were using a similar help desk focused approach. This difference here is that instead of pressuring help desk staff, they actually impersonated a help desk staff and convinced users to allow a remote extreme control session where they would then install malware. What we're seeing here is a clear trend that threat actors are targeting these human workflows and not just systems. Help desks are no longer just a support layer. They've actually become more of an attack vector themselves in these cases. So if your internal processes assume without any trust or type of verification, or if help desk isn't trained to spot social engineering attempts, attackers may be able to exploit that trust. All right, so next up, let's talk about Insight Partners. So earlier this year, this major VC firm, which has investments in a lot of fast-growing tech companies, experienced a breach. While the initial incident seemed fairly limited, more recent disclosures suggest it was actually a bigger deal than first thought. So in this breach, attackers got access to investor data, internal documents, and possibly information related to portfolio companies. So and with firms like Insight, it's never just about the one organization. Their network touches hundreds of others. So the breach here isn't just a risk to Insight itself. It has the potential to ripple across their entire ecosystem. There's also a human side to these attacks. So these investors now have their personal and financial data out there, which opens the door for possible impersonation or financial fraud. It's a good reminder that threat actors are targeting these trust-based networks. So if you're a high-value company like a VC or law firm or consultancy, you're possibly on their radar as well. Flipping the script a bit, in this case, the cyber criminals themselves were the ones who were breached. So at one point, Lockbit was one of the most dominant ransomware groups in the world, but after a major law enforcement operation in 2024 disrupted their infrastructure, they've been under ongoing pressure since. And now to make matters worse, their systems were compromised, leaking their internal data like affiliate chats and negotiations transcripts. So these leaks here gave us a really good look at how the groups manage their affiliates, negotiate ransoms, and then split these ransom payments. They also revealed victim names, some of which belong to companies that hadn't publicly disclosed any attack yet. So this wasn't just damaging for Lockbit, it also exposed sensitive details about their victims too. This is actually the second major ransomware group leak that we've seen this year. Black Basta had a similar leak only a few months ago. So these kinds of leaks are incredibly valuable for us as defenders, as they give us insights into attacker behaviors, TTPs, communication patterns, and infrastructure, all of which helps inform our threat hunts and helps us build better detections as well. And in the broader picture, it shows that even the most powerful ransomware groups aren't immune to disruption, which is why it's so important for organizations to report these incidents. The information uncovered in attacks can be incredibly valuable for law enforcement, as it helps them connect the dots and ultimately disrupt operations. And a prime example of that actually is our next topic, which is infrastructure takedowns. So a major operation known as Operation Moonlander recently took down 2 proxy botnets, 5-SOX and AnyProxy. These networks were being rented out by cybercriminals to hide their locations, run phishing campaigns, and route malware traffic under the radar. The international operation included authorities from the US, Europe, Asia, and resulted in 2 admins being charged and over 70 domains being taken offline. Now, this kind of takedown might not make flashy headlines, but it's very impactful, at least in the short term. When you remove proxy infrastructure like this, you make life more difficult for attackers, as they lose a layer of anonymity, which ultimately slows them down. And sure, determined threat actors will eventually adapt. They'll find new services, spin up new infrastructure. But this kind of disruption forces them to reset, rebuild, and rethink their operations, which raises their costs and ultimately buys us time. All right, so moving on to another takedown operation, this time LumaStealer. Last week, Microsoft, working with Europol, the DOJ, and some other private partners, coordinated a global operation to disrupt LumaStealer, cutting off command and control communications and seizing over 2,300 different domains. So between March and May of this year, Luma had infected almost 400,000 devices worldwide. So this malware was used to gather credentials, session tokens, browser data, and cryptocurrency wallets, with the goal of either selling this data or using it themselves to facilitate further attacks. So Luma was sold as a malware as a service platform, meaning anyone, regardless of their skill level, was able to purchase and then use it. So by disrupting LumaStealer, they aren't just stopping the one actor, they actually pulled the plug on the entire marketplace here. This is a great example of it showing how effective this collaboration can be. So when law enforcement, private sector, and partners are aligned, to big takedowns like this are possible. And while not every incident ends up as part of a major operation, the intel that comes from these reported attacks often plays a quiet but important role in making them possible. And finally, to wrap up the landscape section, we're going to take a quick look at some recent ransomware leak site activity. One of the more notable changes this month is that RansomHub, despite being one of the most active ransomware groups we've seen earlier this year, didn't post any victims this month. So this drop-off follows a strange episode in April where RansomHub suddenly went dark, and shortly afterwards, Dragon Force claimed the group had migrated to the infrastructure, potentially implying some type of partnership here. But that doesn't actually seem to be the case, because shortly afterwards, RansomHub came out denying any type of relationship and even accused Dragon Force of working with law enforcement. So it's a bit unclear whether this is a failed merger, hostile takeover, or potentially some sort of exit scheme. But while RansomHub has been silent ever since then, actually, Dragon Force has surged, now leading all ransomware groups in victim postings this month. So whatever happened behind the scenes here, Dragon Force has clearly capitalized on the moment. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Colin to talk about our observed threat activity.
Thank you for that introduction. Let's take a look at some of the observed threat activity across the MDR and rapid response service. First, let's look at ransomware trends. Over the past month, the top 3 ransomware groups have been Akira, Play, and QLin. These are all groups that have been around for 2+ years that we've seen a wide range of different affiliates using these ransomware as a service programs. We also continue to see different threat actors leveraging ransomware that has had source code leaked and distributed online, such as Lockbit 3.0 and Phobos. These aren't the original Lockbit ransomware as a service. This is more so just threat actors using source code that's been shared to create their own flavor of ransomware. Some smaller niche players that we've seen are Nitrogen ransomware, as well as SafePay, which we've discussed in previous ThreatCasts. In regards to how these ransomware threat actors are actually gaining initial access, most of our cases are related to threat actors gaining access through VPNs. Some of these cases involve exploiting the VPNs, but a vast majority of them are abusing compromised credentials, as well as we've seen a lot of threat actors trying to take advantage of unmanaged assets to gain access to additional devices. And then lastly, we have continued to see some ransomware threat actors leveraging phishing as a mechanism to gain access to networks. That's our trends for the past month on ransomware. Now let's talk about two specific ransomware as a service programs that we're tracking. The first one is 3AM ransomware. We just recently published a blog on 3AM ransomware that my colleagues will be discussing later in this presentation, but I want to provide some background on this group. It emerged in 2023, and it's one of the primary descendants of Conti ransomware syndicate. If you're not familiar with Conti, it's an infamous group that was around from 2020 to 2022 when it disbanded at the start of the Ukrainian-Russian war. Conti ransomware is the group that really revolutionized the ransomware as a service industry or ecosystem by performing data theft extortion and claiming to have victim data that they can then post on the Tor Onion sites and kind of revolutionize that aspect of posting data online and trying to extort victims with more pressure. One of the notable things about 3AM that we've seen recently is their shift in tactics to performing Microsoft Teams-based voice phishing. We've discussed this in the past with threat groups like Black Basta, as well as threat actors affiliated with Cactus. And now we've recently seen 3AM employing this as well. As I mentioned earlier, this group is tied to the Conti ransomware syndicate, and looking at the Conti ransomware leaks, which was a leak of ransomware chat group data back in 2022, threat researchers identified three main groups within the Conti ransomware syndicate. Two of those teams are still active today and have gone through various rebrands. The first group we refer to as Team 2. They originally started operating under the name Royal and then switched to a group called Black Suit, or a ransomware variant called Black Suit, and now 3AM. We assess this with high confidence that these are the same threat actors that just continuously rebrand to try to evade law enforcement attention. The other main team of the Conti ransomware syndicate that we're still tracking to this day is related to Blackbyte and Black Basta. As my colleague Dan mentioned earlier, there have been two major ransomware leaks that have impacted the ransomware ecosystem, one of which was Lockbit, which was recently, and the other one was Black Basta. After the Black Basta ransomware leaks that happened in February of this year, we observed those threat actors pivoting to Cactus, and we assessed that there's a pretty strong relationship between Cactus and Black Basta in terms of their management team. When the Black Basta ransomware chat leaks happened in February, we took a further look at how we can leverage that information to help gain some confidence around these different teams. And I wanted to showcase a conversation that occurred between leaders of this Black Basta ransomware group and some of their sub-managers. Specifically, the leader of the group asked, I haven't seen Royal ransomware in a long time. And what's this Black Suit thing? Is it a ransomware locker? And one of his sub-managers or criminal affiliates said, Royal is no more. They're now called Black Suit. It's a locker and a group, but ultimately it's all the same people between Royal and Black Suit. And so these chat leaks are just one example of how we can further confirm theories that we create through incident response data and our proactive tracking with impacts to threat actor data leaks and try to correlate that information. Moving on to the second main group that we wanted to highlight today is Dragon Force. As my colleague Dan mentioned earlier, Dragon Force has been in the news related to some intrusions that have impacted the UK retail sector. Some reporting references this threat activity as UNC 3944 or Scattered Spider. One kind of interesting detail about that specific threat group or threat affiliate is that they previously were operating on Black Cat. Black Cat was shut down due to law enforcement disruptions, and we saw most of those affiliates move to Ransom Hub. About 6 months ago, Ransom Hub was the biggest ransomware as a service in the ecosystem, and ultimately there was what some people are referring to as a hostile takeover, where Dragon Force and Ransom Hub merged. There may have been some hacking and defacements and some cybercrime feuds, but ultimately this one affiliate has now moved throughout this process from Black Cat to Ransom Hub and to DragonForce. So we as threat researchers have been tracking their career as a criminal. Now, that specific affiliate is just one of multiple affiliates that are employing DragonForce ransomware. Later in this presentation, we'll highlight a specific case study within the MDR service where we observed DragonForce. And let me be clear, that case study is not Scattered Spider or UNC 3944. It's a distinctly different affiliate and campaign. But in general, across all DragonForce affiliates, some of the tools that we've seen them using for remote management that can be blocked in Sophos Central or AnyDesk, PuTTY, and PS Exec. These are very common tools that can be used for legitimate purposes, but also can be abused to pivot across the network. And lastly, on the data collection and exfiltration side, some of these tools certainly are widely used, but other of them we've seen across just specific affiliates would be rclone, Restic, which is a data transfer tool, Wasabi, which is a cloud storage solution, and WinSCP, which is a Windows utility for collecting files. Now, signs of these programs aren't necessarily signs of an intrusion, but if you don't need them, I would certainly suggest proactively blocking them. And that's it for the observed threat activity. Now I'll be passing the mic on to my colleague on threat hunting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colin, and hello, everyone. All right, let's jump right into it. We have two cases that we want to, or actually two hunts that we wanted to highlight. First one is associated with the coffee loader malware. And specifically, I want to kind of highlight some of the obfuscation techniques that this specific loader is using. And first of all, the interesting dynamics of the obfuscation techniques, as well as some of the techniques that we've used in our hunting process to actually try and determine whether coffee loader was actually deployed or not. So let's talk a little bit about what coffee loader is. It is a malware loader used to deploy or launch second stage malware. This specific loader is very closely related to Smoke Loader. Smoke Loader has been around for a while. Smoke Loader is a very modular loader in the sense that it can be highly customized depending on who this loader is sold to as a service, as a product as well. And Coffee Loader is very similar. There is a little bit of a pivot from what specifically Smoke Loader was doing, but overall, the modularity of it is what is making it so interesting and attractive to threat actors at this point. So this specific loader is chock full of different obfuscation techniques that it utilizes, as well as defense evasion. Specifically, this one is used to drop what's called a Radamanthus shellcode, which is an info stealer. This info stealer is interesting because it uses its own obfuscation technique. So it's kind of like defense evasion through defense evasion. And what's even more interesting about it is that it actually is packaged within a Quake 3 virtual machine. For those of you who may remember from your youth, Quake 3 was a very popular video game from late 90s and early 2000s. Over the years, hobbyists have created a very lightweight, extremely lightweight virtual machine that can be used to launch Quake 3 on basically any platform. And what is interesting about that is because it's tapping into the GPU processing power, this specific shellcode, this specific info stealer is utilizing the virtual machine not only for the purposes of utilizing GPU as a processing power and evading detection, but as well as to hide its own code because of the fact that it's packaged within a virtual machine that has its own protective measures and controls. Another associated technique that Coffee Loader is using is parts of its code are actually packaged within Armory Packer. Armory is basically the impersonation or a pivot from the Armor Crate that is developed by ASUS. It is a platform being used for developing software code that can be utilized and executed within the GPU environment and infrastructure. Again, it's an obfuscation technique in the sense that it's utilizing GPU to avoid any sort of kernel type checks that a lot of popular EDR solutions, malware or anti-malware products are utilizing. And as well as it's hiding its own code within a different way of restful state, so that it's not maybe running within the memory itself, and it's running actually within the video card memory. So another obfuscation technique that is relatively novel and relatively new, which makes this a very popular product. And there are other techniques that is being used that I would like to also highlight as well. In this case, we're seeing some of the libraries of the ASUS Armory Crate being utilized. as part of its loading process when it's actually being injected onto the victim system. Another technique that it's using, this is more associated with the actual function of the code itself. The way that it's doing what's called call stacking is that it's splitting its own function into two almost identical functions, and then those functions are then executing a chain of jumps and crisscrossing between each other to basically fool either the software itself that is maybe checking the function calls, or a forensics analyst or a forensics investigator who is trying to trace where the function is jumping from to and from in terms of the memory allocation. So again, this is not something that is going to be definitively hiding its purpose or its functionality, but it's something that is going to be used to kind of exhaust the analyst from looking at the various different jumps and various different forks between the function calls. Just another technique to avoid detection and avoid post-infection analysis. Another technique that is being used is called sleep obfuscation. So whenever the portions of the code are resident in memory, if they are not being used at that very moment, they are encoded and encrypted. This is done through another technique called Windows Fibers. It's a core functionality of Windows that allows for multiple functions to be executed at the same time as part of the same thread, but they're kind of split into two different forks. So there could be an encryption-decryption algorithm running in one fork, and then the actual encrypted code that is resident in memory on another fork. And then the functionality of Windows Fibers allows for the encryption, decryption to happen at execution time, so that the actual resident code in memory cannot be analyzed or scanned or reviewed by either the software or forensic investigator unless the actual code is running itself. So it's kind of a protection for its restful state until the actual code is being used by the malware itself. And then ultimately, a very popular technique that is being used a lot these days is DGA, C2 infrastructure, or demand generation algorithm, where each deployment of the malware comes with a specific algorithm seed that is then being used by the C2 server to generate a domain that is going to be used for C2 infrastructure that is directly tied to that deployment. So it is only reserved for that specific deployment. There are no other deployments that are going to be reusing the same infrastructure, which makes it a lot harder to have static IOCs and hunts being done, for example, for those static IOCs, because each deployment will have a specific, unique infrastructure for its C2 communications and networking portion of the malware. So that's an interesting one. But again, this is nothing new. It's just one of the tools that this specific loader is using for its obfuscation. So this is one of the hunts that we performed. There were multiple, but we just wanted to highlight one of them. In this case, we're specifically looking for those ACES Armory crates type libraries that are being utilized that would indicate specifically utilization of GPU for code execution, which is not commonly seen within an enterprise environment, especially if it's something to do with non-standard software, as well as any executions or utilization of these libraries being used by either new files that are being dropped on a system, files that are resident in non-standard folders, temporary folders, user folders, downloads folders, things of that nature. But again, there are many different things many different hunts as well that can be executed as part of this specific malware family because of the fact that it's utilizing so many different techniques for obfuscating its own purposes. The next one that I wanted to highlight is actually rooted in real-world example where we're observed a Chinese APT actor actually utilizing this specific technique to probe and detect whether a Sophos endpoint agent is resident on a victim system. So how can this be done? Well, generally it's done through registry. There are multiple ways to query registry for configuration and for entries. More popular ways are just utilizing command line prompts and utilizing reg query as a command to identify which keys have which values. Now, this would then have to rely on the user knowing what value to either look for, or they can just have a verbose output of a specific key that is going to kind of spit out all of the results of all of the values and keys, and then you can kind of filter through and see whether you are seeing what you want to see within that specific key. A more complex but also a more effective way to do this is utilizing PowerShell. there's a commandlet called get item property, which allows you or allows a user to use PowerShell to query the registry in the same way that you would do through command line, but with an additional ability to utilize other PowerShell commandlets, as well as to pass back and forth variables. So that means that you can actually utilize this specific command to either pass a new string to your query as needed, to utilize scripts that would then kind of peer into the registry at the time of execution and then dynamically assign a variable based on the output of it, and many other functionalities that PowerShell scripting language can allow you to do. So it's much more effective in the sense that if you know what you're looking for and you want to kind of utilize or avoid specific values in registry, you can utilize PowerShell for that. Or if you're just looking for a standalone output, kind of dumping everything that is in registry, it's much lighter way to do it through command line, through command prompt, utilizing reg query as a language. So in this case, this is a real world example again, which we have observed. The table itself or the listing that you see here is from one of the IRs, and you can actually very clearly see, hopefully, that the attacker was utilizing command line reg query as the command that I've outlined before to look for specifically for the endpoint defense policy configuration keys and all the values that are associated with that. There are some numeric values. There are some values that are kind of hexadecimal, depending on how the attacker is interacting with registry and whether they're looking for a specific key or a setting or not. But at the very bottom, what is highlighted in blue is you can actually see that the attacker is specifically chaining this and piping into a fine string. So they are looking for very specific values of this specific key. So they're looking for things like exclude, whitelist, or blocklist. So they're looking for any settings within the registry that would allow for a folder or a file or an extension to be excluded from an automated scan. And they can utilize that information then to actually deploy their own malware that is then going to be in fact excluded from the endpoint scanner being used. Another example of this was being used on the networking side, where they're actually looking for specifically the intrusion prevention system enable or disables flag within the registry. So they're looking for any sort of network detections in IDS type products that are being utilized or deployed on the victim system. And they're looking to see whether this setting is enabled or not. That would then allow them to have the network communications with their C2 servers and infrastructure. So again, one of the hunts, this ended up being multiple hunts, but in one of the hunts we were looking specifically for PowerShell, PowerShell commandlet being used to interact with registry and to look for any interactions or queries on the Sophos keys, specifically Sophos registry keys associated with endpoint defense and associated also with management. So that we're looking for any instances where the threat actor is looking for values of the keys that are part of the endpoint Sophos agent configuration on the victim system. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Pablo. Hey, so hi, I'm Sean Gallagher, and I'm here to talk to you about some of the things we've been covering on the XOps side in threat research. Let's see here. Got it. I'm sorry, I'm having a little mouse trouble again, as usual. All right, so let's go over the roundup of what we've covered over the past couple of weeks this month. Had a couple of posts go live on some rather interesting things based on research from our colleagues at CTU, as well as our own MDR teams and IR teams. We have, in early May, we had a post on Nickel Tapestry, which is a IT worker scheme being used by North Korea to get hard currency and get industrial espionage through placing North Koreans disguised digitally as workers for companies in Europe and in Asia. And we've also seen it here in the US, where they've had cases where using deepfake video and things like that, they've managed to get themselves places and get through interviews and gain jobs as remote workers for technology companies. Also, LumaStealer, which we heard earlier, just got hit by Microsoft and other agencies and federal agencies. LumaStealer, we have a deep dive on how they had been working and how they changed their TTPs recently. Reminder, just because some of the infrastructure has been taken down doesn't mean LumaStealer is necessarily gone. We've seen these stealers come back strong again and again, even after major infrastructure has been taken down. Also, we had a huge Patch Tuesday this month with 71 fixes. Please check out that article if you haven't already, and if you haven't caught up with your patches yet. And then Matt Wixie has published a whole series of reports called Beyond the Kill Chain, how cyber criminals spend or what they do with their money. It's really interesting. A lot of things get reinvested into legitimate businesses, for example, and it makes for an interesting study in how cybercrime is turned into hard currency. So let's go into the two cases that we've been discussing here, which we've published reports on over the past month. The first is 3 AM ransomware. You heard from Colin a little bit of description of the 3 AM ransomware actors and some of the things they've done. This particular case is interesting in that while it follows the vishing playbook, they actually used voice over IP instead. They targeted an organization by doing fairly thorough recon on them, identifying potential targets within the organization and their email addresses, and then they spoofed the internal IT desk's phone number with a voice call to a specific victim. That was used to gain access via Quick Assist, and they were able to drop an entire KeyMove VM onto the target. That gave them a foothold that hid them from antivirus and from endpoint protection software. And that kit carried, which was ironically called Kali, but also was Windows 7 and not Kali Linux, was used alongside with the QDOR backdoor that was pre-installed on it to get into the local network and move laterally. They were able to get a local admin account leveraging a service account that was vulnerable on the network, and were able to establish themselves on a server with a local admin account and RDP. They did manage to exfiltrate quite a bit of data. Another interesting point in this is they used this Xeox Remote RMM tool, and along with a bunch of other things they dropped out that they never ever really used. But they were able to use this MFA tool for part of their persistence. However, because the target had deployed both Sophos prior to the attack and the Duo and an MFA solution, in this case it was Duo, they were able to prevent the attacker from moving laterally using RDP internally, and they were able to block a number of the backdoors that the attacker was trying to drop onto other targets when they tried to move laterally using remote PowerShell and other tools. They did eventually attempt to deploy a ransomware that was blocked, except for one device that the target never put endpoint protection on. That system was encrypted. There was exfiltration of data, about 868 gigabytes of data to Backblaze over a cloud synchronization tool, another legitimate tool being abused in this case. And while they didn't have much data encrypted, they did have quite a bit of data exposed. So it's not a great story, but it's a good story from the standpoint of tools preventing attacks from getting even deeper into networks and causing even more damage. And that brings us to a quite different ransomware attack from Dragon Force. In this case, Dragon Force was used by an actor who actually used exploits of Simple Help to target a managed service provider and get out into their network. And much like some of the cases we've seen earlier with downstream attacks, you leverage the MSP's connectivity to their customers to deploy ransomware to as many of them as they could. In this case, however, we had one customer who was running Sophos MDR and had Sophos MDR enrolled, and they were protected from the attack, but not such a great story for the other customers or for the MSP themselves. they were all unprotected against the attack and were all encrypted for impact. So great story for our customer in this case, because the actual attack was stopped. In fact, much of the exfiltration was blocked as well. So because Sophos picked up on the attack behaviors and was able to stop them from exfiltrating data. But unfortunately for the other customers who were not running MDR in their environment or a Sophos endpoint in their environment, they were all impacted. And that's what I've got from XOps. That takes us back to Greg.
Oh, sorry about the delay. We've got a fun delay where it takes to get you back on stage after you've come off. Right. So thank you so much for joining. We're at the Q&A section right now. Just before I get started with the Q&A, just a quick reminder. So all of the sort of references to what we've been talking about today, actually there was a question that came in where someone says, do you make these queries available for us to run ourselves? The answer is yes. We're going to actually make that available on the blog post that goes out usually within 24 hours or so of this live session. So if you head on over to community.sophos.com/MDR community-channel. I apologize if I suddenly just dropped then. I think I had an internet stutter. But yeah, you can hop over to community.sophos.com/MDR-community-channel, and then you'll find, I think, in the announcements section, I mean, incorrect. There's a ThreatCast section in there. You'll see the blog post. It'll have all the references, the queries and everything put in there ready for you to use. Just before I carry on with the rest of the questions, just a quick reminder as well. Every week we put out the Sophos MDR threat brief. You can also find this on the MDR community channel in the announcements section. This is a weekly kind of intelligence summary on a variety of topics from cybersecurity incidents to ransomware activity and so on, the latest vulnerabilities. And we make this available in those weeks in between ThreatCasts. So there's many things that we cover in the threat brief that don't make it into the ThreatCast because, we've only got this short period of time to cover a lot of content. So do be sure to check that out. So you can see that on the community channel. There's a button that says turn blog notifications on. If you click that, you'll get notifications straight to your inbox. I will flash it on the screen, but of course, do not panic. All these references will be made available on the community post we make within the next 24 hours. So do be sure to head over to there if you want to go and check out any of these references. All right, we're at Q&A. So let's start digging through some of the questions. So let's have a look. Here's a number I've got down here. Let's go with this one because I'm tempted to say if any of my colleagues want to step in and add some of their thoughts. But the question was, considering that VPN access seems to be a large attack vector, besides enabling multi-factor authentication, what does Sophos recommend for us to effectively monitor our customers? With MDR, are there any additional features or plans for features that will assist in monitoring this attack vector? So in the chat, when I did reply to this individual, let me bring up my answer. I did say sort of one of the first things you want to look at is making sure you've got the Microsoft integrations enabled for Sophos sort of MDR and XDR. So there's a variety of integration packs that we have available. The Microsoft ones are included with all Sophos MDR licenses. So if you're an MDR customer, do go check out, make sure you've got them enabled. I think one is for, let me remember, one's for, I think, the audit logs, one's for security graph. So one's sort of raw security alerts from the security graph. That's one integration. And then the other one actually gives us sort of more fine-grained audit logs, which we actually generate or make our own detections for so that we can actually generate the detections for various events actually faster than they end up on the security graph. So make sure you got those both enabled. That's the first point. The second one is if you are also using sort of Entra ID, yes, of course, MFA should have that enabled, but you can also look towards things like conditional access policies. So conditional access policies are a way for you to set a sort of variety of conditions in which you'll grant access, hence the name. And that can be things like what IP address or what geolocation, what device. And so if you've got sort of, all these sort of various different aspects that you want to set into a policy, might be like, the location where this user is, or at least the device, so that they're coming in from a known asset rather than letting them in on any asset. Things like that can really sort of limit this, so that if a threat actor does intercept an MFA code that's typed in, that really helps. There are also MFA sort of resistant factors. So instead of it just being like a one-time password or time-based one-time password, so like that, please enter this 4-6-digit code. You can also use sort of security tokens. I'd grab mine, but it's currently connected to my device. But small sort of hardware tokens that are a little bit harder for threat actors to intercept the token for, and actually sort of use that as part of sort of a phishing campaign. Most of those phishers rely on gathering those codes that are time-based, rather than it just being like trying to intercept keys from hardware-based security devices. So that's one thing. There's a few other ones that I've got here from Colin, who put them in our chat. So I'll continue to share these. Other things we suggest are things like enforcing password complexity requirements through AD to prevent the usage of weak passwords. This sort of limits sort of brute force attacks to some extent, if you're sort of making sure that passwords are relatively complex. And when we talk about complexity, I have opinions on passwords. Mostly just due to the sheer length. When you sort of enforce a password of complexity where it has to be, it needs to be a minimum of like 8 characters or 12 characters long, but it has to have capital letters and special characters and all this kind of stuff, and numbers, that can be sort of somewhat overloading. I've often gone towards the thing of like utilizing long passwords or passphrases, as I say. I've had a passphrase that I used on a public server for many, many years, just as a weird, I guess, honeypot, to see if it ever gets popped, because there's nothing really important on the server. It runs a Dungeons and Dragons tool for myself. Yes, I am that nerdy. And it's like 40, 50 characters long, because it's multiple words and some weird words that aren't that common, all sort of chained together. And I've never seen any dictionary attacks or anything really have any success against that. So that's another thing to consider. Another things are enabling user account lockout policies on a certain number of failed logons, especially for things like VPNs and so on. If your user is failing to authenticate X number of times, again, limit that. We do often see sort of brute force attacks that take place where an actor is just trying every password combination they possibly can. And if you don't have a lockout policy after a certain number of failed logons, often if you've got the option for it, exponential or some kind of increase in the delay, so each delay becomes more and more painful, and those delays being like a good chunk of time, that really sort of deters any actor from bothering with brute forcing them. Another thing as well, actually, is, and this is the last point, is reviewing the user's accounts that have access to VPN. So in general, and this is something we've seen probably way too many times here in MDR, which is where MFA has been set up and so on, or at least it's been required, but then customers are using or have granted access to way too many users in their estate. Either they've selected like the default all users, group or OU, wherever a user goes. And so we'll see accounts like scanners or printers, which have very simple passwords set to have access to the VPN. And because they don't have MFA, no one's gone and enrolled that individual account in MFA. There is no MFA set up for that account. It has a weak password. It gets brute forced, and we see actors get in that way many times. So hopefully that gives you a few different thoughts around sort of limiting, access and sort of controlling your sort of VPNs to limit that attack surface. All right, let's take a look at some other questions. I've got a number of these. So I'm going to read this one. It says, with the new M365 response actions integration, are the actions automated, or does an analyst need to be involved? Also, how much time does this shave off when evicting an attacker from a compromised account? So this is the sort of new response actions that we've sort of set up. Sadly, I've actually not had anything to do with the utilization of them. So if any of my colleagues got any thoughts on that one, if not, what we'll do is the person who sent that one, I'll take down your name and I'll get you some more details on that, or we'll bring it up next time. I've been meaning to speak to our product managers around it, but everyone's been out on offsite, so I've not had time to speak to anyone. But let me log that question down. We'll get some more details on that for next time. Other questions I've got, and actually I might ask if some of our Intel people want to come and join on stage. I think these are all relatively Intel-based about some of the content we had at the start. I'll see who runs to jump on stage. If anyone. We'll see. I'll start with the question. So why are Dragon Force getting so much coverage? Is it purely the high-profile victims, or are they doing something special that makes them scarier than other ransomware groups? So don't see any of my colleagues coming on stage. So, there comes Colin. Colin, you want me to read that question out again?
The question was, what makes Dragon4 so notable and why are they in the news so much, if I'm correct?
Yeah.
I would say it's partially because of their victimology, and some of their affiliates are very infamous, particularly the ones that are known to target the help desk and have been reported on under the name Scattered Spider. The other reason is their kind of loud ransomware ecosystem actions where they did the hostile takeover of Ransom Hub that definitely generated a lot of press and publicity. I think that some of the reasons why the threat actors decided to do that was to maybe recruit more affiliates by making very noisy decisions.
Nice, thanks, Colin. And these next two, I'll pose to you as well, because I think they're just around the kind of wider the efficacy of takedowns. So, what is the impact of these takedowns of botnets? And the same question goes for Lumma. This is a subsequent question. But these takedowns are sort of threat actors, sort of botnets or botnets or proxies. Do we see less threats in the wake of their takedown? Do these disruptions sort of really make any impact or any kind of deterrent?
That's a great question. I think that these law enforcement actions definitely impact the threat actors' approach and risk calculus around their future goals of committing more crime. But generally speaking, I think unless there is an arrest associated with it, it's more so of a disruption than a large takedown. And so with some of the recent Luma Stealer stuff, it seemed like a large disruption, but not necessarily an arrest of the core developers.
And so ultimately, I was going to say, Colin, so do we really see with sort of these kind of takedowns, is it really more in the deterrent kind of space? Does it sort of do we see sort of some actors disappear, or do they end up just re-affiliating or something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really just depends on the level of impact from the takedown. We've certainly seen prolonged law enforcement disruptions like targeting Lockbit, where they continuously disrupt the service and erode trust in the criminals that affiliate themselves with Lockbit. I think that's going to be particularly true with the most recent round of Lockbit leaks. Not that that was a law enforcement disruption, but a disruption nonetheless.
Nice. Okay, and I think we're coming to the last question, which is, why would a ransomware group rename? Did they think law enforcement and blue teamers like you would think they're some different group of people or something?
Yeah, so on ransomware rebranding, on the topic of Royal Black Suit and now 3AM, one thing that we've noticed is that these threat actors proactively create these new brands and personas so that in case law enforcement disruptions do happen, they already have infrastructure in place to continue their extortion operations, continue making money, and continue performing their criminal operations. So they don't wait until they've shut down to start to create a new brand. They'll run multiple ransomware as a service programs at the same time and start to shift their activities from the old one to the new one as the old one gets more attention from law enforcement, including law enforcement in Russia. There certainly are concerns around Russian affiliates targeting Russian organizations. And that's one takeaway that we had from the Lockbit leaks and the Black Basta leaks, is that these Russian ransomware affiliates are concerned about potentially targeting the wrong person in their own backyard.
Hey, that is fascinating news. I mean, especially when it comes to sort of Russian actors go after themselves. Typically, you usually see that kind of like internal chatter of "do not touch it." So if they're starting to get so desperate or making those mistakes, yeah, they're certainly going to get taken down by their own law enforcement, not the ones you want to get caught by. All right, I think we're at time now. So with that, I'm just going to say, again, please go check out the threat brief. You can make sure you get subscribed to all the show notes, so all the various different references that we have, and the queries from the hunting section will be made available on the MDR community channel within the next 24 hours or so. So be sure to go check that out. But until next time, all I can say is thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking a concerned, interest in what's going on in the cybersecurity space. I firmly believe that us sort of sitting around communicating, talking about intelligence, be it intelligence from ourselves, be it intelligence from our peers in other organizations, it's a key part of staying sort of connected, communicating and staying one step ahead of actors and always staying on top of how they're kind of shifting and anticipating where they go next. Until next time, all I can say is, stay vigilant, stay suspicious. If you have any concerns whatsoever, do not hesitate to reach out to the MDR operations team at your earliest convenience. The sooner the better. All right, until next time. Thanks so much. All right, you take care.